Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in the road to COP30, celebrating the Paris Agreement almost 10 years on, achievement, challenges and calls to action. It is my absolute great pleasure to invite a very distinguished panel of speakers to reflect on how we actually got to the Paris Agreement and what we need to do to deliver on the tripling of renewables, doubling of energy efficiency, and to delivering on all of the goals of the Paris Agreement, holding temperature increases to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade or as close as that as possible, balancing our greenhouse gas emissions with our absorption capacity, and above all, and key for this COP, aligning financial flows with our climate goals. So in order to do that, I will first give the floor to Emmanuel Guérin, who's the Special Advisor to Laurence Soubiana, who, as you probably all know, is one of the architects of the Paris Agreement. He's also a fellow at the European Climate Foundation and Instituto Clima e Sociedade. After Emmanuel, I'll give the floor to Ilina. You'll have to excuse me for mispronouncing your surname, I'm sure. Radoslavova?
Go with the last one.
Ilina, she is head of Coalition for Action at the International Renewable Energy Agency, and Maria Jose Torres, who will, after Ilina, talk to us about the experience from a Chilean and Latin American perspective, given that we have COP30 happening next year in Brazil. Maria Jose is a resident coordinator at the United Nations in Chile. So thank you so much for joining us. I know your schedules are fully packed and COP is a very competitive space, so I really want to thank you all for being here and the audience, of course. Emmanuel, I would like to ask you to reflect on how we actually got to the Paris Agreement. You know, we went from COP15 in 2009. We all hailed that as a diplomatic debacle for the European Union. When I was writing about it, I thought, well, you know, this has bits and bobs that could actually make for an agreement in the future, and I think that's what we saw constructed afterwards. So I think that would be probably food for thought for when we despair in COPs, because some of the bits and bobs that can come out of difficult diplomatic situations can then be salvaged into something that can then, years after, when we mature it, be thought of as a resounding success, even though, we need to deliver on it. So if you can, share your experience on, how we got there, what were the key elements to push us through the finish line, and please be as provocative as you can.
Thank you very much. And first, many thanks for the invitation, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to spend some time with you this afternoon. So yes, a few reflections on the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, but for the most part as well, looking forward on the road from COP29 here in Bakú to COP30 in Belém next year for the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. As you said, when we negotiated the Paris Agreement, we did this with Laurence Soubiana and quite a few others, learning the lessons from the failed attempt at negotiating a climate agreement at COP15 in Copenhagen. And that was a very personal experience of failure, because I was already in the job of drafting the agreement, not for the Danish presidency, but for the UN. And so Laurence was also involved in the failure of Copenhagen. So I can tell you that we spent the next few months, maybe even the next few years, at a very low point, not just in global climate politics and policy, but also at a very personal level. But we got out of this hole. We got out of the hole by, as I said, learning the lessons from Copenhagen, but also looking at the forces at play within geopolitics and the real economy, on finance, on society. And so it's really as much from an analysis of the reasons for failure in Copenhagen as almost an observation of the forces pushing in the right direction and the forces against us that we thought of designing the negotiation for the Paris Agreement. And I must say, because in the meantime, in between Copenhagen and Paris, Laurence Tubiana and myself, we were teaching. We used some theory to design the framework for the negotiation. Let me just mention three in particular, but there are more. I mean, first, the combination in between a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach. The Paris Agreement is not just a bottom-up approach. I mean, the bottom-up approach is the nationally determined contribution, but the top-down approach is the long-term strategies to net zero emissions. And I can remember that it was an obsession for Laurence and myself to include those hard-won sentences back in the days about the balance in between sources and sinks of emissions and the need for countries to plan on long-term strategies and not just for the next 5 or 10 years. So we were even running a project just before the Paris Agreement that was called Deep Decarbonization Pathways. And I can remember to this day that we had to insert into the bilateral agreement in between China and the US those few words, and none of them thought it was important. And 10 years after, everybody is looking at pathways to zero emissions. So it's a big achievement. But also another strand of theory, if you will, looking at climate negotiation as a regime complex and going beyond the negotiation among nation states and involving non-state actors. I mean, that too today is a given. It's plain vanilla for everyone who attends a COP, but it was in fact 1 year prior to Paris in Lima that we came up with that approach, which was very important to frame climate action as an economic opportunity and not with the doom and gloom of the negotiation among nation states. Some parts of the theory that had to do more with communication, because we took very seriously the job of communication, and in fact one of the first jobs we did 2 years before Paris was to have a draft of the press communique that we wanted to have coming out of Paris. We never had a version of the negotiating text. People kept asking us if we had a secret text that we would put on the table if the negotiations failed. I can tell you, for being the one responsible for actually drafting, that we never had a parallel version, a plan B, but we had multiple versions of the press communique we wanted to see in different markets and for different audiences. So thinking that this is about shaping expectations and that expectations shape investment is something that we took very seriously. But obviously today, and to move to the second part of my brief intervention, both the context is very different. It's obvious geopolitically, it's obvious economically as well. To summarize to the extreme, I would say that we are in a worse place when it comes to the geopolitics. There is no point in denying it, but I would stand by the comment that we are in a better place economically, that we're more advanced in the transformation, even in places like the US. I mean, what the federal government will do needs to be compared with what states and cities and businesses and investors will continue to do in the US, in particular with the tax credits that were passed through the Inflation and Reduction Act. But it's not just that the context is different. It's also that the objectives of this very negotiation is very different. We're very much in an implementation phase and no longer in a phase of building the global framework. Thank God we've got that, and we can concentrate on the objective of accelerating the transition. So what I thought is, well, what if we were to apply the same logic we applied before the negotiation of the Paris Agreement to today's context and today's objectives? What would be some of the priorities, I think? And I came up with 5, which I'll touch on very briefly, but happy to respond to questions after that. The first, also because we're in a COP in Bakú where finance is the main point on the agenda, the first is about finance. And to summarize, I would say that we need a different approach in between the COPs or the Paris Agreement and the international financial institutions at large. So that goes in the category of what I said of the climate negotiations having to be looked at as a regime complex and not just one point only. And I think it's very good news that, in a way, since COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, we're discussing about the reform of the international financial institutions within the context of COPs. I would like to see the COPs and the negotiations under the Paris Agreement act a bit more like the G20 is acting vis-à-vis international financial institutions, and in particular the International Monetary Fund for everything that has to do with macroprudential policy. And also to create the fiscal space to invest in the transition. And of course, on the other hand, the multilateral development banks so that they can have more capital to leverage private investment, and I think critically also more guarantees to crowd in private investment. But to summarize that first point, I think we need COPs and negotiation under the Paris Agreement, not just to send signals to the IFI, but also ask them to report 1 year on, 2 year on the progress they've made to respond to these requests by COPs. So that would be the first point. Second, I think we need to elevate dramatically the issue of adaptation and the cost of impacts. We're already doing it, but frankly, for a long time in these negotiations, there's been a tendency to think that adaptation is for developing countries, and it's mainly an issue about finance. And frankly, it's not. It's not just for developing countries. It's for all of us. And I think up until the point we've got mini national 1.5 report for all of the countries of the G20 to start with, and not for the countries of the Climate Vulnerable Forum only, we will not deliver at speed the energy transition and the food and land use transition. We're more than 15 years now after the Stern review, but I think in these negotiations we've not yet incorporated looking at the opportunity cost of adaptation, impacts and mitigation. So frankly, I don't want to make a bureaucratic point. Let's not overload the nationally determined contributions, but I think countries of the G20 need to look at the impacts for themselves of different scenarios, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3. And this is what will create a much stronger incentive to move at speed in the energy transition. Third, even if I realize that this is a long shot, I think we need to start today. I think we need to bring the topic of carbon inequalities in our discussions, and not just carbon inequalities in between countries. The International Forum is an obvious place for doing this, and we need to continue pushing on that interpretation of climate justice. but also inequalities within countries. I mean, there is a number that I find very striking. In 1992, when we were starting to negotiate on climate with the Rio Convention, 2/3 of the carbon inequalities were explained by inequalities in between countries, and 1/3 was explained by inequalities within countries. Today, it is exactly the opposite. 2/3 of the inequalities are explained by inequalities within countries, and only 1/3 by inequalities in between countries. And that's in particular because in large emerging market economies, the level of carbon inequalities is in fact to the level of the US, which is almost the double of the European Union. And let's be frank, it's the source of the climate backlash in all of our jurisdictions, those inequalities. So I think we would be very inspired if some countries chose to come up within their national determined contributions with a plan that doesn't only reduce emissions in absolute average terms, but shows how we make the big polluters pay and protect the poor and the vulnerable. I would be very thrilled to see that included in some NDCs. Fourth, I think we need to enter into a different chapter of the relationship in between COPs and the negotiations under the Paris Agreement and the role of subnationals. We've been champion of that with Laurence Toubiana for a very long time. I'm just coming yesterday from Rio, where I participated to the Urban 20. I saw real excitement here and real dynamism, which I'm happy to convey because sometimes the geopolitical context is a bit depressing. I think it was very good news to see Brazil make a reference to the role of subnationals in their NDC. And I think that it's not only the best insurance policy we've got against Trump in the US, but it also has a value in and on itself. I mean, it gives a lot of depth to the political commitments that are made by countries. And here too, I think we should emulate what Brazil has done and really show how we will articulate the national plans with the plans from the subnationals, and we're quite far from that at the moment, so I think it's another era where we should progress. And to conclude with the fifth point, responding to your invitation to be a bit provocative, I think we need to tackle head front the issue not just of trade, but trade and investment partnerships. It's a fairly toxic conversation in this context with, you know, all of the discussions about unilateral trade measures, etc., etc. But I think at one point in time, this body is going to have to say something about what are not just trade agreements that are made a bit compatible around the edges with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, but actual trade and investment partnerships that help us to deliver on the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So as I said, those 5 points are probably not comprehensive, but they just came to mind when I thought, okay, if we were to apply the same logic as the one we had in mind 2 years before Paris, it would probably look something like that.
Thank you. That was eye-opening for me. And thank you for sharing your personal reflections. I know, you've been at it for such a long time, and it was a great success that we have this agreement now, and now we have to make it work. So on to the how do we lead with the implementation of the tripling of renewables, doubling of energy efficiency in order to meet the 1.5 or as near to 1.5 as possible. Elena, all yours.
Thank you so much for sharing these insights. I think it's very inspiring to hear stories from from the start of actually before even the Paris Agreement was there. And I think that now, once we are already 10 years from now, the signing. I think it's also a good time to reflect on what has been achieved, but also how we move from there. And I would like to elaborate a bit more on the power sector, because the power sector, as you know, is one of the contributors, the biggest contributors to the emissions, but also the power sector as one that is holding a great potential, and also as a cross-cutting with the other sectors who are also emitting heavily. So last year we had the tripling pledge signed and the UAE consensus. More than 130 countries actually agreed to triple their renewable energy capacities and double the energy efficiency improvements. But we believe that now it's the time to move from the pledge to the action and to meet this gap between the ambition and the action. And this year, actually next year's national determined contributions actually provide a good platform to do that. And IRENA analysis showed that actually NDCs find the renewable energy. We find the renewable energy as one of the most frequently mentioned mitigation strategy by the countries, and the countries also recognize the potential of renewable energy to mitigate emissions, but at the same time simultaneously meet objectives around energy security and socio-economic development, and those two industrializations, which is very important, for example, for the African continent. And while talking about increasing the renewable power, also last year, 2023, we've noticed the biggest ever increase in new renewable capacity. So we have currently 473 new gigawatts of renewable capacity, which is almost 85-86% of total new installations. So basically there's already a business case around the renewable energy, so it's no longer considered as something expensive, unaffordable source that needs to be supported by public policies, by feed-in tariffs. There's already a business case, and we see very high investment interest in that. Unfortunately, the flip side is that renewable energy investments are only focused towards a few economies, mostly European Union, China, Brazil, United States, and the rest of the global, especially the global south, stays unserved. We see that capacity for, well, the good and the most of the expansion is in solar energy, but we need more diversified energy sources to guarantee this security and reliability of the supply. Only last year, the solar capacity reached the global installed capacity reached almost 4 terawatts, and the share of solar is 2 terawatts, but it took less than 2 years to add the second terawatt in the solar. So you can see, like, it took almost 60 years to install the first terawatt hour of solar, and then almost less than 3 years to have the second terawatt. So you can also see the speed. And still, the current indices, as we analyze them, to reach the 1.5, we need 11 terawatts to be added to the grid. Currently, as I said, we are at around 4. And if we analyze the indices, we see that the ambition is around 5.4 terawatts. So quite insufficient in order to meet these global targets. So one of IRENA calls also to the governments to reconsider their national plans, to align the national policy, the energy planning with this new global pledge, and also to include this in the next round of the indices, because we see that there's a disconnect between the current level of the indices, the national planning, which is a bit more ambitious, and the pledge, which is actually shows the highest level of ambition. And we have less than 6 years remaining for the implementation of these commitments, and we need to immediately put this into action. the other thing that is also quite concerning is that we don't see this high level of ambition from the G20 countries. Actually, we notice they're the largest gap in terms and misalignment in terms of the ambition. The other concerning part is that we still witness quite high level of fossil fuel subsidies, which actually are counterproductive to scaling up renewable energy investments. Therefore, our call to action is to raise the ambitions, to align the national policies with the commitments that are made under the climate agreement. And since you mentioned the finance, it's a very important part of the equation. However, we have to think about more than 150 developing countries that are still lacking this level of ambition. This level of investments. They have high ambitions, but most of their NDCs are actually under the condition of gaining this financial support from the developed world. Not only the finance, well, I also want to touch on the other parts of the support, which also comes with the transfer of technology, with exchange of know-how, with technical assistance to build a pipeline of good projects that can actually raise the capacities on the ground. And I would like to give an example with the African continent, who needs to quadruple its renewable energy capacity by 2030 and get to 250 gigawatts, which requires billions of investments, not only in the capacities, but also in the supporting infrastructure. It also requires investments in workforce in order to help the continent reach their targets. LDCs also...
Can I just ask you a question?
Sure.
Because you spoke about skills.
Yes.
And I was in a really interesting panel yesterday with Irina, organized by Irina, by your colleagues. And I can't resist to take this opportunity to ask you about your call to action for skills for tripling. So if you can touch upon that, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are analyzing the jobs development in the renewable energy sector, and for last year we saw the greatest increase. So from the previous year we had 12 million jobs. The year after there were already 13 million jobs in the renewable sector, and last year we have 16. So for 1 year we had a growth of 3 million jobs, and it brought us to the idea of actually starting discussing this pledge and the need of dedicated actions on behalf of the governments in terms of, like, on one hand, accelerating the work on digital skills, the technical knowledge that is needed for the transition, to make sure that we have the workforce in place when we need to actually implement the tripling, integrating this requirements into the national planning. This is very important. The countries need to decide and be not short-sighted, looking into 5-6 years ahead, but looking 30 years ahead, because the energy industry is capex intensive, but also it requires skill force which you cannot build overnight. Therefore, we are also calling for integrated national planning, where not only capacities and grid expansions are planned, but also the workforce. We would like to incentivize more public-private partnerships, introducing standards and certifications that could be mutually recognized by the different countries. And we also call for this new development to be inclusive. Currently, the energy sector is still lagging behind in terms of gender parity. Fortunately, the renewable one is doing much better compared to the fossil fuel, but we need more women on the job as well. So maybe I can stop here and we can continue later.
Great. Thank you so much. Maria, So you're taking us away to all the way to COP30. We know that Latin America has played a key role in the adoption of the Paris Agreement as well, and in increasing the ambition. We know many countries in Latin America are part of the High Ambition Coalition. Chile, obviously, is one of the prime examples. It adopted its climate change law in 2022. It includes a net zero commitment. So can you please paint the picture of what we can expect in moving forward to COP30? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lara, and such a great opportunity and very inspiring colleagues. Actually, I was fascinated to listen to the two of you. So I work in Chile. I'm the United Nations Resident Coordinator. We are 19 agencies, funds, and programs. And I don't think it's going to be a surprise after your words that one of the most important areas for the UN in Chile is to help Chile realize the ambition established in the NDCs. And beyond, actually, we are engaged in the next NDCs, the NDCs 3.0. It is interesting what you mentioned, because if you think about the Latin American region, it really concentrates most of the biodiversity of the world, and it's not only the Amazonia, but it is certainly it all. I think we are thinking about Brazil, and they have done a great job in sensitizing also about the need to protect that as patrimony for the humanity. But it's also the natural resources, the critical minerals. I mean, we can find the lithium reserves that are biggest in the world in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and Bolivia. We also have, because most of the Latin American countries are in the middle income country frame, they are not the most polluting countries in the world. So there are some highly developed or medium-term developed, but they are not the ones who are causing the emissions. So you are seeing a group of countries that very quickly understood the edge of really working towards implementing the Paris Agreement. And I think back to their different roles, I think everybody knows about Brazil and the fact that they are very active here. They have been very active in the G20. Interesting, your remarks. But I think also Chile, where I work, they were the presidency of the COP in the COP25. That was in 2019. Was held in Madrid. It was a joint COP between Spain and Chile because of political events in Chile. They led a number of very important discussions at the time that are very much integrated into our current discussions. Carbon markets, Article 6, the climate finance, with countries recommitting in the Chilean Spanish COP to 100 billion climate finance goal, lost and damaged. And I mean, something very, very important is the impact of natural disasters in the economy, in the social fabric of Latin America. It's a region that is constantly affected by hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, flooding, in a way that Europe is starting to experience more and more. But I think loss and damage makes a lot of sense also for the Latin American countries. Now, how this materializes in what Chile internationally has been doing, I think it is also very important that they are helping to sensitize on the importance of keeping the Antarctica untouched, because they are one of the countries who are part of that movement. I was very privileged to be part of that mission to Antarctica with the President of Chile and the Secretary General prior to COP28, actually. The Secretary General had been in the Himalayas before, showing how the glaciers were disappearing, and actually we could experience also in the Antarctica the level of heating of the water and the impact that has in the climate in the Humboldt current. There is the kind of climate equalizer for the region. So it is all connected, obviously we know that, but we need countries from the global south also being very vocal about what is the impact. And it's not about only industry. I think that's the angle that the Latin American countries come with, and they are very strong on that. So what we are doing, and Chile is doing prominently, revising these MDCs, is really putting in action this climate law that you referred to. Interestingly, the climate law was endorsed by this current government, but Chile has been very much a climate champion through different governments. So it hasn't been necessarily just a right or a left government issue. It has been a country issue, and because they have built up also the evidence, the universities are extremely engaged in scientific research that actually can put in evidence all these elements that we are discussing here. And particularly our current Minister for Environment, he was one of the experts in the IPCC for a number of years. So you have expertise, capacity, research, and impact analysis that was reflected in a law that put together 15 different ministries. And I think probably one of the most difficult things to do in implementing NDCs is these conversations that are normally very siloed, because normally the Ministry of Environment is not the most powerful ministry in any country setting. But I think being able to put into a dialogue the Minister of Finance with the Minister of Labor, with the Minister of Social Protection, for instance, I mean, made a big difference. And we are very engaged as UN helping materialize the local planning, because the law established the obligation to really create those different local plans. The other element that is extremely important is that because Chile in particular, but also Latin America, has the ambition to become one of the most important markets for renewable energies. And particularly, I think for the European market, they are considering to be kind of 12% of what they would like to see happening. So we have all kinds of renewals there. Green hydrogen being one of the most aspirational areas for development, certainly for Peru, for Brazil, for Chile. I was last week in Antofagasta, the northern region of Chile, and the Ferrocarril of Antofagasta, that's the railway, inaugurated the first green hydrogen locomotive that is going to serve the mines. You know, this is one of the biggest mining areas in the region, in Latin America, with the biggest companies investing there. It was copper. Now it's going to be lithium. And now it's going to be served by a green hydrogen locomotive with the caveat that they cannot still in Chile produce green hydrogen. They are working towards that licensing, and it's being served by Brazil. So it is a total private sector initiative, making the point that from the region, and particularly from Chile, we are having also private sector understanding the importance of positioning themselves because it's competitive. It does speak to the markets, as we are seeing here as well in COP29. And my last point on the experience of Chile is, you know, there is no transition that can be socially accepted and suffer and succeed misinformation if it's not inclusive. And I think the area of social inclusion is becoming, or just transition is becoming increasingly important, because most of the areas with all these renewable energies are produced are indigenous communities. And actually this conversation that you were putting at the table, Elena, about women being part of this transition, because actually this is a very much male type of profile, right? The mining, the extractive industries, the new renewable energies, and more, I think they are making an effort also as Chile to attract more women into those type of skill jobs. So to finalize my presentation, and we can get into more elements, I think there is a lot of sharing between Latin American countries as they prepare for the COPs. And I would like to really, is Costa Rica, is Brazil, is Chile, but there are other countries also extremely engaged, and I think they are a power force in some of the conversations. Second, for instance, Barbados is bringing from the Caribbean a very strong advocacy on the need to reform the international financial architecture that you touch upon. So this is, again, an initiative that is coming from the region. And I think going into Brazil, I think I can tell you, because I'm sitting in the Global Compact, that is this initiative between the UN and the private sector, that they are putting all their energy into being extremely proactive in Brazil, because they see, again, the importance of being cutting-edge industry and providing this type of renewable energies to the world. I'd like to leave it here and we can discuss.
Thank you ever so much. That was fascinating. I didn't cut you short, and I'm not going to ask you any of the many questions that I have, because I do want to give the audience a chance to speak to you and ask you questions. Anyone in the audience? We have a truly great panel. Mariluz? Yes, we have a couple of questions. Perhaps I'll have a round of 3, a round of 4. Very quick, please.
Yeah.
If you could say one word, who you are, because we do have to finish at 10:02.
Okay, Mariluz Castella from the Spanish Green Growth Group. Just a question, you can have it at the end, but which are your wishes for that COP? I mean, you have described the Paris Agreement, but which would be your best wishes for the outcome of that COP, and what are we learning?
Thank you very much. At the back? Yes, I think. So hopes for the COP, do we know anything from the negotiations?
I would like to know your opinion about the global gateway strategy from European Union. Thanks.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front.
Hi, I'm Pau de Vilchez from the University of the Balearic Islands, chair of the Climate Change Committee there. My question is to Emmanuel. Since you mentioned adaptation, I was curious to know what is your position towards the adaptation strategy taken by the French government, which assumes that France is going to warm by 4 degrees by the end of the century. I was curious to know about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Anna at the front.
Yes, also, okay. I'm Ana Barreira. I'm the director of the International Institute for Law and the Environment in Spain. And my question is also for Emmanuel. It's regarding your first point. And as you know, that took place the Summit of the Future with the Pact for the Future. So what I see is that there is always a very similar language in every fora, but not really much action. So it's really tiring to see that. So what do you think that it would be the next step? Because this has been discussed from a long time ago, the reform of international financial institutions. And also, what do you think about the issue of converting UNEP similar to the World Trade Organization, given that this has been on the table also from Rio Conference, proposal by Helmut Kohl. How do you see this? Do you think this might happen now, that it didn't happen even in Rio +20? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Easy questions, all of them. So I'm going to start with Emmanuel and... Okay.
In response to the first question, maybe 2 things. One is not going to surprise you, but this is just to stress the importance of getting to an agreement on the long-term goal on finance here, because quite frankly, even if we all have our eyes towards Brazil and COP30, I don't think there is success at COP30 if there isn't an agreement that is reached here on finance. I mean, it's not something that, it's not a can that you can kick down the road. It is fundamental to rebuilding trust, to providing also a clear framework for investors. So that's obviously the first one. I have another wish. I don't know if that's going to come true, but I think it's about time that we've got a president of COP30 appointed. We've all waited very long by now. It was announced at the UN General Assembly. I still laugh about myself because when I started working with the Brazilian government just at the beginning of Lula's 3rd mandate, I was telling them, based on the experience of Paris, it is much better to have a 2-year plan than to have a 1-year plan. I hope it's not going to be less than 1 year. Brazilians often think that they can wing it at the end very joyfully. I hope so, but frankly, I think it'd be good to be able to see the face and the body of who is going to be COP president by the end of Bakú. About the French adaptation plan, I've got mixed sentiment about it. positive first, not to contradict the point that I made earlier. I think it's vitally important that all countries, including G7 countries, become much more serious about adaptation. I mean, in all fairness, and not just because we're speaking in the Spanish pavilion, but Spain has been much more advanced than many of the other European countries in raising the issue of adaptation, both nationally and internationally. So kudos for that. It's really important. As I said, I think we need to do more by mobilizing insurers and reinsurers to tell us about the cost today, not in the future, and the part of it which is insurable by them, because oftentimes it's not. This is what we're seeing more and more from California to Florida. I mean, there is no business model anymore, and that is something that needs to be injected into government thinking, because if it's no longer the private sector picking up the bill, then it's going to be the public, and that's going to be a very different issue with taxpayers. And I think this is when we're going to start talking for real about taxing fossil fuels, because it's going to be the only way out. I said I've got mixed feelings because I'm no longer in government. I can say those things very openly. I can tell you that the environment minister did adaptation because it didn't want to do mitigation. So that's really the story, and that's unfortunate. He thought that he would have an easier way through. And by the way, the 4 degrees for France correspond to 2 degrees globally. So it's not that we were making, well, it's catastrophic, but it's 2 degrees globally, 4 degrees for France. So I'm happy that it triggers a different debate in France, also because you've got the experts sometimes saying, well, it's not just that adaptation would be more costly for 2 than 1.5, it's that we would simply not know how to do it. And so this is adding to the urgency of moving forward with the energy transition, I think. I've got a similar comment on the 4P initiative. Our dear President Emmanuel Macron loves new initiatives, from the One Planet Summit to the One Forest Summit to the 4P to whatever. I think it's important to build on existing initiatives as opposed to adding one more each and every time. So I'm really that's why I'm really looking forward to Brazil for setting out the agenda for COP30. This is why I thought, irrespective of the countries that are member of the Troika, that it was an interesting institutional innovation to have at least, let's hope, continuity from one presidency to the other. I think the first One Planet Summit was good. Then all of the other editions, frankly, would have benefited from no, I know. I'm talking about all of the initiatives that are Summit of the Future. Summit of the Future, I think, had really good language on the reform of the MDBs, to be honest. And this is where I'm asking about, these documents to not simply be nice reports, but to have a forcing mechanism, be it at COPs or be it at the UN more generally, to get those financial institutions to come and report back on the progress they've made. Because frankly, I'd love to see the decisions that were made in the Summit of the Future implemented by shareholders of those finance institutions.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether you want to react to any of the questions, Lina.
Absolutely. So from my part, I would also like to stress on the finance, and also from the perspective of currently we still have 685 million people without access to energy, and almost 2 billion people without access to clean cooking fuels. So when we're talking about finance, we have to make sure that I'm hopeful that first of all we are going to reach an agreement and get to some figures but also it's not only about the volume of the finance, but also of the quality of this finance. We should avoid indebting the global south and face another colonization. We have to make sure that we look at this as an opportunity to create new jobs, to boost industrialization, to economic growth for those countries that are currently lagging behind. And it translates into low-cost, affordable financing in the form of concessional loans, in the form of the grants that these countries are actually need to receive, and to avoid locking them into unsustainable fossil fuel investments and infrastructure. I would be also happy to see more examples as the ones given from Chile, where the different institutions are talking. And it's not only about the interlinks between energy and climate, but also the other highly polluting sectors like industry, transport, buildings. So all the sectors that are actually contributing to this climate catastrophe that we are already almost facing, they need to speak together and avoid this siloed approach when we are talking about climate change. And it has to be not only a horizontal coordination, but also vertical. We need to speak to the local governments as well. So they also have their role to play in the energy transition and make sure that the new, I'm talking for the power sector and the renewable energy new capacity, to make sure that those capacities are built with full public acceptance and support. And I would stop here.
Thank you. Maria?
Yes, so I'll take the Summit of the Future and the Pact of the Future and working. Okay, so I think the idea of the Pact of the Future, it was really to galvanize the type of international architecture that we think we should have. So it's repetition in the sense that it's placing the climate action agenda at the center of the political multilateral institutions. I'm not aware of the transformation of UNEP into, but it will be interesting. I'd like you tell me more about that. But I think what is most important actually is that necessity that the Pact of the Future is going to be coming and translated into the actual mechanisms. So it's not something in addition, it's just to reinforce and to make sure that we don't lose the whole institutionality, because we are in a situation that we cannot address the geo-strategic differences through the Security Council, for instance, right? So it was really putting back the agenda, bringing back human rights, and also including something that the UN has not touched upon until now, as well as climate, because climate was a very important addition. We didn't have climate as part of the mandate. FAO, UNEP started to do something, but it was a very small, marginal agency. Now it's obviously much more central. Now it's the whole area of new technologies and digitalization and the new generations. I think this is this foresight to see the development of the planet as something that we need really to take into account. And back to your point, I totally agree. It's very clear on the reform of the actual international institutions. Again, back to Barbados and to the Bridgestone initiative. For the Latin Americans, it's a very important area of coherent approach. And I think back to the role of Spain. Spain is hosting next year in Seville the financing for development, exactly, which is going to be an opportunity. Again, all these efforts, I think, need to build blocks. And sometimes what happens is that we are all very specialized, which is normal. Yeah, we cannot know about everything. And we are not able to put together the initiatives. And I think this has to build forward. Global Gateway, we are very much, the European Union and the UN has this strategic dialogue in countries where the Global Gateway is being put at the service. Chile being a big one. Imagine the amount of resources that are being pledged into basically the green hydrogen and the lithium, but also all sorts of renewals in there. I think the work that it's coming is precisely to do what Elena was talking about, is this transitioning through the workforce, and this has to happen in a dialogue also with the workers, which they are not against, but you need to do it with them. And that's, to me, one of the weakest points. So we are in dialogue with the European Union delegation to see how we are positioning also the UN with all the different sectors, you know, from government and private sector, because this is a dialogue that needs to happen also with the private sector. It's a great initiative, but I think it's difficult to really get it down and implement it. So ask me a year later, please, because we are in that. I don't want to. And my wish certainly for this COP financing, I totally agree. We cannot just jump from a no agreement to something fantastic in Brazil. I hope really it's a call of responsibility for everybody who is here. I was in the finance discussion, the high-level panel. I could see a totally different type of pledge depending on the countries, which really worried me. So I hope they do the magic that you did from the origin. And also my wish is that, in a way, we look into the COPs and their way of being mainstream and coordinated. So the climate, the biodiversity, the certification, because in the end, the topics are not so far apart when you are thinking about implementing it at the national level and mostly at the local level, as we were discussing. I think that to me will be an extremely important outcome. I think Brazil is thinking about that, but I think we need to start to continue that conversation.
Thank you ever so much. So we've gone from failure to finance and geopolitics with Manuel. He spoke to us about, you know, how now we need to have a different approach to the reform of the international financial institutions, how we need to elevate the issue of adaptation, how we need to take into account carbon inequalities, the role of subnationals, cities, I would add. We've spoken about also trade and investment partnerships, to be a bit provocative. The need to do this with the skilled workforce, the need to speed up the deployment of renewables and do that with society with us, and the hope to come out of this COP with a very strong message to COP30. That means a new collective quantified goal that takes into account the needs of those who are in dearest need. So thank you ever so much for joining us, and thank you for a great panel.